From a campus in Ohio, June 17, 1964. Dear people at home in the safe North, Mississippi is going to be hell this summer. We are going into the very hardcore of segregation and white supremacy. I'd venture to say that every member of the Mississippi staff has been beaten up at least once, and he who has not been shot at is rare. It's impossible for you to imagine what we are going into, as it is for me now, but I'm beginning to see. I'm taking you back now to Mississippi in 1964, and I want to say that right at the beginning because I felt kind of odd when I began researching this, because I had been to Mississippi a couple times. I've been down on the Gulf Coast and also through the Delta with Bob Moses, as I'll talk about in a minute. And I recognized the great changes that had taken place in Mississippi since 1964. All of the things that I grew up with, all of the stereotypes that I had seen in the old movies like In the Heat of the Night and in the newer movies like Mississippi Burning, just didn't apply in Mississippi anymore. And here I was, coming out of the north, where I live, Massachusetts, talking about the same old Mississippi, about the truly difficult, hard, and very defiant and racist days. And I wanted to make sure in the book, I made so sure that I put it in the prologue, that this is Mississippi in 1964. It is not Mississippi anymore. And I also spend some time in the epilogue explaining the changes that took place in since 1964. There's one wonderful quote that I use in the epilogue that I think sums up the difference. It's from Merle Evers Williams, who was Medgar Evers' widow. And she said, in dedicating a monument to James Meredith at Ole Miss, she said, "Yes, Mississippi was, but Mississippi is, and we are proud of what we have become, and should be proud." I want to move up now. With that caveat, we want to go back to the way Mississippi was. In 1964, Mississippi was, let's be frank, a racial hellhole. America itself had its own variety of racism at that time, and I think modern readers and listeners, in looking back only to within my lifetime, almost wouldn't recognize either the Mississippi or the America of 1964. In 1964, the Kennedy assassination was still a very, very touchy subject. It had only happened a few months before, and America was still tormented by that violence. In 1964, in the spring, Lyndon Johnson's Civil Rights Bill was struggling in Congress. It was being held up by what is still the longest Senate filibuster in history. Most Southern senators filibustering against it. It was by no means certain that was going to pass. In 1964, some of you, I'm looking out here, may remember cars were big and beefy, and they had wonderful flamboyant tail fins and loud engines under the hood that roared down my street and many of yours. In 1964, Marlboros and Kents were advertised on TV, and half of all Americans smoked a pack or more a day. In 1964, 99% of American homes had television, so television was very much with us, but almost all were in black and white. The most channels you could possibly have on your screen were 7. And in Mississippi, most people had about 3 channels. Not a single one of those programs showed a dark face in any but the most subservient of roles. I say at the beginning of my book that in 1964, America was suffused by an unbearable whiteness of being. Pardon my pun. But it seemed very accurate and appropriate. In the halls of Congress and in city halls across the nation, all of the faces were white as the ballots that elected them. Elsewhere in America, civil rights movement was making some progress. You had had the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 56. You'd had the desegregation of Little Rock High Central High in Little Rock in 1957, the sit-ins in 1960. You had Martin Luther King making his famous I Have a Dream speech in 63. But in Mississippi, it was a whole different story. Mississippi, Nina Simone, singer Nina Simone, had a wonderful song. She sang, "Everybody knows about Mississippi, goddamn." I saw her recently sing that on YouTube, and it's hard to describe her face, but when she sang those lyrics about Mississippi, her face was just filled with rage and anger. Mississippi, it was the era of Ross Barnett, some of you may remember, and one of his quotes was that God was the original segregationist. It was the era of the citizens' councils, the white citizens' councils, who spent tax dollars to defend segregation against such pro-integration groups as the U.S. Air Force, the Elks Club, and the YWCA. In Mississippi, it was also the era of the State Sovereignty Commission. The State Sovereignty Commission, which again was funded by taxpayers' dollars, hired spies and informers. They compiled dossiers on 250 organizations and 10,000 individuals. All of those are online, by the way, which was wonderful for me. The State Sovereignty Commission's publicist has written a memoir of those years, those 10 or 15 years. He called the book Mississippi's Defiant Years. But other Mississippians were not so euphemistic. Walker Percy, the novelist, in 1965 wrote, "During the past 10 years, Mississippi as a society reached a condition which can only be described as insane. In Mississippi in 1964, black sharecroppers were still picking cotton, as they said, from kin to caint. From sun up when you can see, to sundown when you can't. And they were doing it for $3 a day. And the powers that be were determined to make sure that it was going to stay that way. If an African American tried to register to vote in 1964, the first thing that happened was that their name was published in the newspaper, and often their address. Within days, their credit was cut off if they had any credit. They might be fired or sent off their plantation, and in some cases, a shotgun was fired into their shack. For this reason, only 7% of African Americans were registered to vote in Mississippi. In other states in the South, the figures were 30, 40, 50%. In Mississippi, only 7%. And so, when it came to the deep, deep South, the civil rights movement stalled. And so you had the old Miss riots in 1962, and you had Medgar Evers killed in 1963 here in Jackson, and you had drive-by shootings in Greenwood and Canton. And in Macomb, further south, in the spring of 1964, 5 black men simply disappeared. I got interested in this story about 15 years ago when I met Bob Moses. And Bob Moses is by no means a household name, as he should be. Bob Moses is the architect of Freedom Summer, and I think one of the most courageous Americans I have ever met or could imagine. I was doing a story on Moses' algebra project. He was a math teacher in 1960 before he came to Mississippi. He was a man who came out of Harlem, went to a nice New England college and eventually to Harvard, and he was teaching math in a fairly good prep school in New York when he looked at the pictures from the sit-ins and he decided he had to get involved. He came to Mississippi in 1960 and again in 1961, and he came alone, when no other civil rights movement leader, other than the ones who live here, would dare to come to Mississippi. Martin Luther King wouldn't come here. It was simply too dangerous. Moses came alone, and the stories that they began to tell about him soon made him a legend. Bob Moses was a man who went into Liberty, Mississippi, and began to talk to people farther south from here, deep, deep south, began to just stroll around and talk to people in their shacks and in their homes about voting rights. And he began to gather people who would go to the courthouse. And he talked with a very low voice. He's still alive and he still talks. You can almost not even hear him. He speaks so softly. But he had developed an icy calm that he knew was necessary to calm the terror of Mississippi blacks. One of his trips to the courthouse in Liberty, a man jumped on him and beat him with a knife handle. Moses got up with blood running down his face, got up and walked with terrified people who had come to register, led them right into the courthouse, said very softly, "I'm here to register blacks to vote." He was arrested. He was taken to the police station. He said, "I have a right to make one phone call." He picked up the phone and he said, "I'd like to call the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. and reverse the charges." And the cops are just looking at this guy like, who is this, who is this man? Who would dare to do this? When they saw his connections to the Justice Department, they said, "Well, you can go." He said, "No, I wanted to serve my time. I was arrested." So he spent 2 days in jail. And when he was bailed out, a big, huge cop came up to me and said, "Boy, are you sure you know what you're about?" Well, Bob Moses kept doing that, and he worked on for 2 or 3 years. The story spread around about Bob Moses and his organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is now known as SNCC. And gradually, more and more people joined, and more locals decided if Bob Moses could risk this, so could they. But nothing was happening outside of Mississippi, and all the violence in Mississippi was not making as many headlines as thought. And so Mississippi really stood at a crossroads. And Bob Moses decided that Negroes in Mississippi, as he said, were not going to get the vote until the equivalent of an army was sent here. And now I'd like to read you how the idea blossomed. What if, Bob Moses thought in the winter of '63, what if instead of Mississippi's black vote struggling in isolation, what if hundreds of college students came from across the country and poured into the state? Wouldn't America pay attention then? What if, along with registration drives, these volunteers staffed freedom schools, teaching black kids subjects their separate but equal schools would never teach? black history, black literature, and the root causes of poverty? What if, in the spirit of America's new Peace Corps, this domestic Peace Corps set up freedom houses all over Mississippi with libraries and daycares and evening classes in literacy and voting rights? And what if, at the culmination of the summer, delegates from a new Freedom Party went to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, beneath the spotlight of network news, to demand that they, not Mississippi's all-white delegation, be seated at the convention?